Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us at Remars. Hopefully, you're having a fantastic time throughout the week. Keeping in line with the AI and ML theme at Remars, in this session, we are going to talk about how do we make Alexa's sound more human. Before we jump in, quick introductions.
I am Andy Breen. I head up the text-to-speech research team.
Thank you, Andy. A fun fact about him, he was the founder of the unit concatenation technology about 20 years ago when he was at British Telecom. And now he and his team are helping us phase out his own technology. I'm Nikhil Sharma. I work as a product manager in the Alexa speech team, specifically focusing my time on text-to-speech technology. Let's begin, if I can find the clicker. There we go. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to start with what is a voice strategy. What's the approach that we have taken from a voice strategy point of view at Amazon and at Alexa. We'll also take you behind the curtains, kind of share some of the technology that makes Alexa speak in a fluent, natural manner. So let's jump in. We'll try to leave about 5 to 10 minutes towards the end for a little bit of Q&A, if we can get through all the slides. So why is text-to-speech important for Amazon? Obviously, we use the technology for powering a host of Echo devices. We also use it for other Alexa devices like Fire TV, Fire Tablet, etc. The same technology is also used for powering a host of AWS AI services like Amazon Connect, Amazon Lex, and of course, Amazon Polly, right? So text-to-speech plays an important role throughout Amazon products and services. So what is a voice strategy? Put simply, it's the ability to interact with a product or service simply by voice. There may or may not be other modalities like touch or clicking available to the customers, but the primary interaction is taking place through voice. There are multiple components to it. Why it becomes important? First of all, speaking comes naturally to human beings. This is one of the first skills that we learn, so it's just easier. Second, it is frictionless. You don't have to learn where to click, where to tap, whether to touch or not. You just speak to the device, at least in case of Alexa, or otherwise in whichever form your product or service takes, and stuff happens. Lastly, it's hands-free, eyes-free interaction. Personally, I always listen to my audiobook while I'm cooking in the kitchen. It just helps me multitask. Now, some of the components that make up Alexa's voice experience, we want to share that with you. First of all, it is human-like. We've tried to emulate human-to-human interaction and try to make that same interaction possible when you talk to your Alexa device. Second, we've made a consistent and conscious effort to make sure that customers are deriving utility out of every interaction that they have with Alexa. Alexa has a personality. People ask Alexa for a variety of things. And subconsciously, we as human beings tend to form an opinion or an impression about the product or service based on what and how we are hearing. So in that context, having a personality with Alexa becomes important. Last but not the least, Alexa is a cloud-connected service. It's always learning, always improving with every subsequent interaction with the customer. And that helps us kick off a constructive feedback loop through which we can continuously work on improving the customer experience. Now, what are some of the core factors that we want Alexa's voice to project? We know that Alexa is a communal device. People keep it in their family rooms, kitchen countertops. Families sit down and play with Alexa in the evening, and so on and so forth. And in that context, it becomes extremely important for Alexa's voice to project a trust and secure environment, right? Second, Alexa's voice has to project a conversational style. It's almost as if two friends are talking to each other. Alexa's voice also has to be intelligent, or at least has to project the intelligence through voice. Customers use Alexa for a variety of different use cases. On one extreme, they ask Alexa about planets, about black holes, quantum theories, etc. And on the other extreme, multiple times in the day, sometimes customers ask Alexa to tell a joke. And the voice has to be intelligent enough and maintain a consistent intelligence while delivering through all of these experiences on both extremes and everything in between. Right? Last, Alexa's voice has to project a pleasantness and respect for customers. Our objective always is that after every interaction with Alexa, customer leaves with a smile on their face. There are multiple times when customers say some of the nastiest things to Alexa, and even when that happens, Alexa has to maintain the right level of respect for the customer, and the voice has to project it. Right? Now, what are some of the factors that you may want to keep in mind as you think of adopting a voice strategy? First of all, the personality of the voice. In case of Alexa, we have made sure that she sounds helpful and patient. She is consistently calm. She is always polite and honest. And there are a host of personality traits that you may want to include in the voice of your choice as you adopt a voice strategy. In case of a voice strategy, voice becomes your primary vehicle for brand projection as well. When we have visual interface, the moment you look at C-3PO, you think of Star Wars. The moment you look at an image of Santa Claus, you're thinking festive mood, holiday season, joyful environment. And when you don't have visual interface and only are interacting through voice, the voice has to project the brand image that you want to maintain. If your product or service appeals to a specific gender or is oriented towards that, you have to factor that in the voice. And lastly, as you think of voice strategy, you want to target the customer wherever they are. And if that involves considering cultural and regional aspects, then you want to include that. As an example, when we built Alexa's Japanese voice, we included courteousness as an additional personality trait because keeping in mind the culture, right? We also want you to hear from some of our partners who have adopted a voice-forward strategy. Policy Bazaar is an insurance marketplace in India for Indian customers. And as you can see, the fact that voice has an Indian accent was an important factor for them so that they could establish a connection between their services and the customers. Halfway around the globe, in the UK, in healthcare is a digital health and patient monitoring service. And in their use case, it was important that the voice has caring, tone, and attitude. So all of these factors come together. I'll leave you with three kind of takeaways. Number one, voice is important. Juniper Research predicts that voice commerce will become about $80 billion worth of market by 2023. And in that context, one has to actively think about what's a voice strategy in terms of your products and services. Second, as you think of voice strategy, you want to make sure that you're focusing on making convenience and utility happen, because that's going to drive the adoption. And lastly, we want you to create lifelike experiences as much as possible in the voice environment, because customers have come to expect it, right? I'll invite Andy to talk a little bit about what goes on inside the Alexa and how do we make the technology happen.
Thank you very much, Nikhil. So Nikhil has told you a little bit about the voice strategy, and what I'm going to do now, as Nikhil says, is give you a little bit more about some of the technologies that we use to make that happen. So I'll put this in some sort of context just to give you an idea. So obviously we'll have an Alexa device such as an Echo. An utterance from that will be sent to the Alexa service. That will be passed on to the automatic speech recognition system, whence a sequence of words will be recognized. That sequence of words will then be passed on to our natural language understanding system, where meaning, intentions are extracted, and those intentions are then passed on to a skill, and the skill is going to do something with that. It's going to provide a directive, And that directive, and the one we're interested in for the rest of this talk, is text-to-speech. And so I'm going to be giving you an introduction, a very high-level introduction, sort of technologies that we're doing with text-to-speech, and where machine learning comes into that. But first of all, a little potted history. So speech synthesis has been of interest to human beings way back to ancient Greece through the Renaissance, but I'm going to concentrate on the more recent history of what has happened since electronics have appeared and digital computers. And I'm going to start with the Vocoder, which was invented by Dudley in 1939. It wasn't a true text-to-speech system because it was a machine that required a skilled operator to manipulate key-like operators that, through a speech model, produced synthetic speech. So this is what it sounds like.
Will you please make the voter say for our Eastern listeners, good evening, radio audience. And now for our Western listeners, say, good afternoon, radio audience.
Good afternoon, radio audience.
Okay, but it wasn't until the 1980s with systems such as DECtalk, which were true text-to-speech systems where you had dedicated software that took the orthography, converted that through to dedicated hardware that produced a synthetic speech, again through a dedicated model, an understanding physics model, if you like, of how we produce speech. The most famous example, I think, of this is that perfect Paul, or a derivative of that, was used by Stephen Hawking throughout his life and became synonymous with his voice. So you might hear that when I give you an example now.
I am the standard male voice, perfect Paul.
This is the result of trying to imitate a female voice by increasing the pitch, reducing the head size, and lengthening the open quotient.
So in both of those systems, they are intelligible, but they are by no means natural. And this lack of naturalness was seen as a fundamental limiting factor for the deployment of text-to-speech in the broader commercial market. And as researchers, we really hit this glass ceiling. We were simply unable to take our models as they were then and reach the naturalness that we perceive naturally or normally as human beings. Then in the 1990s and through to the 2000s, a new technology related to digital encoding for cell phones started to appear, and speech researchers said, well, let's take a step back. Instead of trying to generate sounds, let's see if we can encode sounds and then select from these encoded sounds. So we adopted some of the techniques that the researchers in encoding were using and applied these to our speech synthesis approaches. In so doing, we obviated the need to generate models that were very natural. We just simply recorded material, encoded that, and then selected from that. This technique was called concatenative synthesis, and it became the dominant technology from about 2000 all the way through to where we are today, even with the Alexa systems as they were in 2017, highly sophisticated. But let's have
This is an example of Alexa using our concatenative text-to-speech system.
Okay, highly natural, but as I said, we'd sidestepped the problem. We'd encoded ignorance. And then, unexpectedly, in 2016, there was the emergence of a generative model based on machine learning. It just came out of the blue. And it seemed to offer all those things that as speech researchers we had been looking for.
This is an example of Alexa using our neural text-to-speech system.
Okay, so I'll be explaining a lot more about that in the coming slides. But first of all, I want to explain to you how, as researchers, we cut the problem up. So what is text-to-speech? Well, simplistically, you take text, any text. It could be a poem, it could be a Wikipedia page, it could be a news item, it could be a dialogue from a dialogue system, and you convert that into, hopefully, a compelling synthetic speech signal. Well, we do this by dividing it up into 3 steps. And the first step is something called text analysis. We take the text in, and we extract as much knowledge as we can, linguistic knowledge typically, part of speech, the syntax, but most importantly, the sounds of a language, known as the phonemes of the language. So as native speakers of English know that the text that we use, the letters, don't simply map to the sounds that we speak. So there is a process that we have to go through of converting those characters into a system of sounds, the so-called phonemes, as I mentioned. And these sounds, this phoneme set, is the set that carries the meaning. So the oo, the ah, the e. But that's not enough. because there's more than just meaning in speech. There's expression, there's emotion, there's intention, there's a certain energy that goes with it. The phonemes don't give us that. We need to have something else, and that's the second stage. The second stage is the method of prosody generation. Now, prosody is all that stuff that goes on beyond the oohs, the e's, the ahs, right? It's the stuff that is the rhythm of speech, the pitch of speech, the loudness, everything that gives speech its dynamism. We use mathematical models derived from the text to try and predict this movement through time of the prosody, as it's called, of speech. So that's the second stage. We take the information from the first stage, the linguistic knowledge we've learned, the parts of speech, the phonetic sounds. We take the models, we combine those two bits of information, and we pass it to the third stage, the synthesis. The synthesis system has to take that knowledge and convert it into natural sounding speech. So I'll be talking more and more about these stages throughout the presentation, particularly focusing on the last two stages. But these are the three stages that I think most researchers would recognize. They may argue here and there, but it's pretty much what we do. So in order to understand the benefits of neural technology, I want to take a step back and talk about concatenative technology, the stuff that we'd used for 15 plus years and was extremely effective in what it was capable of doing. So I'll talk about that, and then I'll explain why neural technology is so important for us. As I said to you, three stages. Here again is the first stage. I'm not really going to talk much about that. First stage is produced here, a machine-readable set of phonemes, and that will be the input to our second stage. And then we have these mathematical models that will produce the prosody, and then we'd have to synthesize something. And in concatenation, how do we do that? Well, I'm going to use an analogy to explain what we do with that, so it's slightly simpler to get the idea of it. Imagine we want to paint a picture, and we have a finite palette of colors. Some greens, some blues, and if you live in the UK, a lot of grays if it's a seascape. And we have this finite palette of colors that we have to reproduce this scene. Well, how do we do this? Well, by analogy, of course, what we want with speech is we want a palette of sounds. And that's what we do. We go into a studio, we record all the common sounds in a language for one voice talent. We put this in our palette, and then we select those sounds based on the phonemic information that's come out the front end, as it's called at the first stage, and concatenate that, hence the term concatenative synthesis. But there are problems with this. As I said to you, speech is a combination of the segmental sounds plus the prosody. If you have to try and encode all the ways that I can say a sound, from the duration I make it, from the pitch and I make it, all of a sudden, your palette of sounds is huge, impossibly huge. So now you have a data sparsity issue. So going back to the analogy of colors again, there is another problem. So how do we address this problem, first of all? I want to talk about a bit more about that. So you've got this big palette of colors. How are you going to address that? Well, the simplistic solution, the one that we typically use, you go into the studio, you say to the speaker, please speak in a passive manner throughout the recording session. Say everything in the same way, with the same pace, with a sort of, calm pitch that doesn't express any particular emotion. So you sort of neutralize that whole dimension of prosody, and therefore when you select a sound, it's roughly going to sound approximately the same for the pitch and the durations. So that was the technique, the trick, if you like, we used to constrain the palette. But there is another area that I did want to talk about. If you have a palette, and going back to colors again, suppose you had all the hues of greens and reds and everything, so you had a beautiful palette, but every green was just labeled green. Every blue was just labeled blue, so on. Well, when you tried to create that picture, you simply couldn't do it because you don't have enough information. So this is the selection problem. And that's what has occupied the minds of most researchers for that 15 years. So we started out with rules, then we went to statistical models, such as hidden Markov models, and then we went to neural models that try to build highly sophisticated neural systems that selected the best compromise that you can. But no matter how sophisticated you get, if you don't have the sound, you can't pull it out. If you want an expressive speech and you haven't recorded expressive speech, you will not get expressive speech. Simple as that. That was the glass ceiling that we were at. Enter neural TTS. All of a sudden, we are now generating sounds again. So there's the potential here of generating any sound. And that's why everybody went, wow, when it appeared at a conference in 2016. Because we've been waiting 15 plus years for something like this. So let's talk a little bit more about this, just to put it again in some context. So statistical parametric synthesis, or the vocoders, this is the one with the models in, they actually were pretty flexible. You could ask them to do something and they would give it a best shot. But they just couldn't be natural. We just didn't know how to make them natural. Then we sidestepped that for 15 years by going to unit selection, which could be very natural. I mean, if you have a palette and you just pull back the exact sounds, it's going to be just like a recording. And of course, generally, you can get pretty high quality with unit selection hybrid synthesis. But it's just limited. You cannot get the expressivity you want out of it. Enter generative models. And you say, well, hey, why are they below natural speech if they're so great? Well, and you may have heard that, oh, neural technologies can now produce speech indistinguishable from natural. And I'll explain why that is true, and yet why it's not where we want to be. So I mentioned to you that with concatenated speech, we went to the studio and we said, just be very calm, say it all the same way. So you have this very big database of calm speech. When we started to research into neural models, where did we get our speech from? Well, the concatenated systems that we had lying about. So we trained our models on this very predictable speech. And lo and behold, those systems did a very good job of it. They could mimic that style very well because it's a very predictable style. But that's not what we want. We want to be expressive. We want to be able to. Unfortunately, we haven't tried that yet. We still got to find out how far we can pull these models away to do all these expressive things that human beings do so naturally. That is the future, and that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now, about how we creep towards where we hope neural technology will take us. But I'm going to take, I promise this is one more introductory slide, and then I will get to the ML. How do we as speech researchers represent the speech signal? Well, how is speech produced? Well, first of all, you expel air from your lungs, it goes through your larynx, they vibrate, it gives you the pitch, then you form a shape in your mouth, which forms resonated, which then causes a pressure wave. The pressure wave propagates through the air to your eardrum converts that via the Hammond steps into a mechanical movement that goes to a membrane in the cochlea vibrates a liquid in the cochlea, the hairs of the cochlea then vibrate, and those vibrations of the hairs of the cochlea are translated into a signal that the brain likes. So that's the mechanics of it. So we need to find a representation that replicates that as best we can. The speech signal is a great signal, and people can use it, but we can think we can do better. Before we do that, we have to put it into a form that we can use it in the computer. So we sample it. We actually sample this pressure wave. The top green line is the pressure wave. We sample that 24,000 times a second at least. So we have a pretty fine-grained digital representation of the signal. And then we say, well, what would be a great representation for this? So we looked again at the human ear, and we find out that what the human ear is doing is basically a filtering, a frequency-biased filtering through these hairs. And we've replicated that in what's called a spectrogram. Often you'll hear it as a MEL spectrogram, and it's called a MEL spectrogram because we found that the filters of the human ear aren't linear. They are biased towards the lower frequencies. And you can see there's an awful lot of energy through the color intensity represents energy. And you can see there's a lot of information in those lower frequencies, and that's where the human speech intelligibility sits. And as you go up in frequency, it's more compressed, and there's less information there, but there's a lot of intelligibility, there's a lot of naturalness there. So the human ear sort of squeezes out different parts of the spectrogram to focus in on the bit that guarantees the best likelihood for decoding. So we've used the same representation as the human ear does. It's, for the cochlea. And we do that for recognition and also for synthesis. So the MEL spectrogram is our go-to representation. And that's the representation I'm going to be talking about for the remainder of the presentation. Okay, so how do we do it? Well, I'm not going to talk about the first stage, but I am going to talk about the second and third stages. So, as I mentioned to you, the phoneme features are taken from the first stage, and now these go into a machine learning model called a sequence-to-sequence model, and I'll talk about that in the coming slides. Phonemes are put in there. What do we produce? The male spectrogram. So the first job is to get a representation in this frame-based male spectrum that encodes all the sounds in a natural way, as well as this prosody that I mentioned to before. Once we have this intermediate representation, we then move it into another model, a neural vocoder, as it's called, which is a speech synthesizer, the third stage. And its job is to take this representation and produce compelling speech from it. So those are the two stages, and I'm going to talk about each of those stages in a little bit more detail in the coming slides. So firstly, context generation. So how did we do this? Well, a sequence-to-sequence model. I'll give you a little bit of an analogy about that because it's a bit mind-boggling when you first see these things. So I'm going to talk about machine translation as an example, a sort of high-level example. So imagine you've got a sequence of English words, and you want to translate that to a sequence of French words. So you've got a sequence-to-sequence translation here. And the challenge here, of course, or one of many challenges, is that there may be different numbers of words in different sequences or different orders. So the sequence-to-sequence model has to convert a sequence that is represented here from a very different sequence represented there. So it's a very challenging job. When we talk about speech synthesis into this intermediate representation, you've got the phoneme as an input, a symbolic representation, going to a spectral representation. So a very complex sequence-to-sequence translation problem. The solution to this came in understanding how to encode and then decode the sequences. And this is the encoder-decoder model that's in front of you. So when you train the system by passing through lots of sentences and lots of spectrograms. The system has to learn that. And in the sequence-to-sequence modeling with the encoder, the first job is to encode the input sequence into one representation. So you sort of squeeze all the knowledge into one representation. Once you've got that representation, you then pass that representation to the decoder, whose job is to stretch it all out again into another sequence. It's an almost magical process, but that's exactly what happens. So once you've trained it, you pass in a sentence that's built into a representation. You pass that representation into the decoder on the right-hand side, and that's the sort of yellowy box coming in here, and it says, I know what to do with this, and it produces its first spectral slice. Then it takes that spectral slice, passes it back around with the representation, and knowledge representation, pushes it back in again, and produces the second slice. And it's this regressive generation of spectral slices, and it keeps doing that until it's sucked all the knowledge out of that encoded representation, and then it stops. Amazing. So it's a really tricky job to decode it, and so we've had to try every trick. And one of the tricks that seems to work very well is something called attention, and that's quite difficult to give a feel for what attention does in the phoneme to get spectrogram case. So I'm going to use an analogy of machine translation again. So if you imagine that you have to take a sentence of words and compress all that into one representation, there is a tendency for the words at the beginning of the sentence to be forgotten or down-weighted to the ones you last saw. The attention mechanism keeps a reminder of the relative importance of those words earlier in the sentence, and it retains that information. And then when you decode it, it gives a kick to the decoder to help it recognize, hey, this was important at some time in the past. Now, when we're talking about phonemes to spectrograms, it's not quite the same. But we've learned that attention, in this sense, helps the decoder decode and move forward at a natural pace. It just gives a little helping hand, and also helps the transition from one sound to the other to be slightly smoother. So it's a subtle help, but it really does make a difference. So that's the context generation. That's stage 2. Stage 3, the neural decoder. I am not going to explain this slide. It's an amalgamation of all the techniques that are currently used to generate synthetic speech. But you may ask the question, what is so tough about generating speech from a spectrogram? Well, after all, you generated the spectrum through an analysis of the original signal, so why is it so difficult? Well, there are two aspects to it. First of all, when we generated the spectral representation, it was an approximation of the speech signal. We take 50 milliseconds maybe of time, and then we convert that into what's called a spectral frame. So we're already losing information when we take this approximation. Secondly, it's a power spectrogram. So it only really talks about the energy in the signal as it moves over time. There are other aspects of the signal that we throw away, such as phase, the relationship of samples through time. So that's completely lost. The second influencing factor is, of course, that this is a predicted spectrogram. So it's smudgy. We're not perfect. And that, combined with the first, means it's a very difficult job for the decoders to regenerate all that lost information. How do we do it? Well, we take the spectrogram into the decoder as spectral frames. We upsample it so that it's now 24,000 times the seconds we represent the spectrum. And then the speech coder has an internal representation of this, and from that generates a sample or a distribution of samples, which you can then select the one you like. That sample spits out, and then you take it back again, and as before, you concatenate it with a spectral frame, and you keep doing that until you've absorbed all the spectral frames, and lo and behold, you've got your speech waveform. Now, the interesting thing about a neural decoder is all it cares about is the spectrum. It doesn't care where it came from. So that led us to ask the question, how do we train it? Now, you could train it with a speaker's voice. So you have a speaker-specific prosody prediction component, and that has to be speaker-specific because it retains the accent, the language, and the voice properties of the individual it's trained against to produce a spectrogram. But your neural vocoder doesn't have to be speaker-dependent. So you could train it on one speaker, or you could train it on 3 speakers, or you could train it on 7 speakers, or you could train it on any sort of spectral properties that you've got lying about. And that's exactly what we did. And we said, well, what happens? What happens if we do that? And I've got some examples here. So the first one is a voice talent speaking from a child's book.
In no time at all, Goldilocks was fast asleep.
Okay. Then the next example is with, I think, speaker-dependent models. So this is what happens when we just did a speaker-dependent solution.
In no time at all, Goldilocks was fast asleep.
Pretty close, right? And then, if we just threw all the data we had at it.
In no time at all, Goldilocks was fast asleep.
So how did we assess which ones were better? Well, we did a subjective test where we asked people the level of naturalness on a score to 0 to 100, which they felt was the most natural. Now, interestingly, you can see that these vertical lines here with the box plots, the mean line is represented by the line across. But the recordings don't get 100%. So human beings don't rate human speech as natural. It's a distribution like everything else. So that's the first thing to be aware of. But as you can see from this representation, on this subjective test, the universal model, that's the model that we built from all the sounds, clearly has the best stability and naturalness. So it would seem to be the case that, as usual in machine learning, the more data, the better. And that these systems are capable of generalizing how to generate a sound from a spectrogram. And it need not be a linguistic sound. You've got a paralinguistic sound in there, which is why I chose that rather odd example of the snoring. And we tried this with laughing, and we tried it with coughing. And remarkably, these systems produce very compelling examples of this. But of course, the other thing you can do, once you've had a universal vocoder, you can speak any language you like without having to retrain that vocoder. So we've got some examples of that.
Je tente de me calmer et de la jouer cool, même si j'espère que la soirée ne va pas s'arrêter là.
En aquel momento, se fijó en otra cosa, una vitrina situada bajo un cartel que rezaba liquidación de otoño.
ルシア姫は我に返ってカロアを見た。
Evie, do you reply?
From Abidjan, we sailed to Cape Town for our next successful trade exhibition.
Okay, I'll leave it there. It goes on a bit, that one. Okay, so let's pull all this together. So we have the stage 1 generates phonemes. That goes into our first neural model, the sequence model. Sequence model converts the phonemic sequence into a spectral sequence. The spectral sequence then goes into our universal neural decoder to generate synthetic speech. How are we doing? Well, okay. So here's the concatenation system from the last year or so.
Pike Place Market is a public market overlooking the Elliott Bay waterfront in Seattle. The market opened August 17, 1907, and is one of the oldest continuously operated public farmers markets in the United States. It is a place of business for many small farmers, craftspeople, and merchants.
And now, the neural model.
Pike Place Market is a public market overlooking the Elliott Bay waterfront in Seattle. The market opened August 17, 1907, and is one of the oldest continuously operated public farmers markets in the United States. It is a place of business for many small farmers, craftspeople, and merchants.
Okay, so you can hear it's more relaxed. It just gets it. It's smooth and more consistent. But it's still very neutral. Why is that? Because we trained it on the material that we had lying about at the time. But we want to investigate expressivity, and we will ask the question, well, what happens if we mix in a different speaking style? So we trained it on more than one style, so you're adding data again. Will the system be capable of learning the underlying properties of a style, separate them out, and then when asked to regenerate it, will it be able to regenerate it? And this is what we did. So we chose a style, and the style we chose was newscaster because it's intuitively a style that people would be able to recognize. Then we labeled the data with an embedding, as it's called. It's just a representation of that style. And when we trained it with the fact that, okay, this is a news item, okay, this is general text. And we got the system to learn it. And then we pushed it through. So what happened when we actually synthesized and said, I want you to say this phrase in a newscaster style? So let's hear it again with the concatenation first.
San Francisco's $2.2 billion Grand Central Terminal open. Spanning 3 city blocks, San Francisco's $2 billion transit terminal is open after nearly a decade under construction. Coined the Grand Central of the West, the new Salesforce Transit Center near the heart of downtown is expected to accommodate 100,000 passengers each weekday and up to 45 million people a year. It welcomed its first passengers and visitors this month.
Okay. Now, the newscaster style, so we've injected the style.
San Francisco's $2.2 billion Grand Central Terminal open. Spanning 3 city blocks, San Francisco's $2 billion transit terminal is open after nearly a decade under construction. Coined the Grand Central of the West, the new Salesforce Transit Center near the heart of downtown is expected to accommodate 100,000 passengers each weekday and up to 45 million people a year. It welcomed its first passengers and visitors this month.
Thank you. So it is a compelling difference, and we went, wow, when we heard it. It was a nice moment. But when you speak, you're trying to convey a meaning. Now, these systems have been learned from the data that we had available with the text associated with that data. But we want to go further. We want to be able to inject into these systems some sense of meaning. Now, there's a technique in natural language understanding called context word embedding. And that is where you've taken a huge corpus of words, and then you try and understand how the relationship of these words behave in a reduced space such that the meanings are encoded within the contexts. So this is called context word embedding. What we thought, well, let's try including context word embedding, injecting these context-sensitive meaning vectors into our attention mechanism when we decode. So it's got the attention for the sentence, and it's also got this a corpus of world knowledge, if you like, context-dependent, that it can draw on to give it a further kick of meaning. Can the system use this context word embedding knowledge to provide a further sense of the system of understanding what it's saying? And so that's what we tried. So the example, so listen to the word to. I know it's slightly biasing you, but I think you'll hear the difference. So here's without context word embedding.
There are 2 kinds of such events.
And now with context word embedding.
There are 2 kinds of such events.
So you can clearly hear that the system has learned that in this context, the word to should be given more emphasis. All right, well, let's pull all this together. So first of all, let's start with a concatenation again.
Republican lawmakers are hoping to vote on their massive tax reform bill this week. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin says it would be the single biggest change to the country's tax system.
Okay, now let's move to neural technologies, again with the passive style.
Republican lawmakers are hoping to vote on their massive tax reform bill this week. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin says it would be the single biggest change to the country's tax system.
Okay, let's put a newscaster style on top of that.
Republican lawmakers are hoping to vote on their massive tax reform bill this week. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin says it would be the single biggest change to the country's tax system.
And let's inject some meaning.
Republican lawmakers are hoping to vote on their massive tax reform bill this week. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin says it would be the single biggest change to the country's tax system.
So you can see we are going up in naturalness. And then, of course, let's compare it to a natural speaker.
Republican lawmakers are hoping to vote on their massive tax reform bill this week. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin says it would be the single biggest change to the country's tax system.
So we've made incredible strides. So this technology appeared out of the blue in 2016. We're now in 2019, and we've already started to look at expressivity, the injection of meaning. So we're at the very beginning of what this technology can do. So where are we heading? So, as I said, the first thing to do was make it natural. Let's just get over that barrier of naturalness. And that's what the generative models have done. I think we can say that's cracked. But we do want to make it expressive. We want to be more human. We want to open up these opportunities of what it really is about when you speak. And there's so much richness in the way we speak. I mean, it makes us human. So we really want to be able to be expressive. But we're expressive for a reason. So the final thing we really want to do is make these systems aware. We want them to say, well, what should I be saying? How should I be saying it given the context? So that the next stage, if you like, is to be expressive and do so in a way that's aware to the sensitivity of the reason that you're speaking at the same time. And that's the future. Thank you.